Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning back in. You know, over the last couple months, I've done several videos that talked about fishing milfoil and ways to break milfoil down to maximize the number of fish that you're going to catch. But I haven't really talked about the baits that I like to utilize when fishing around milfoil. You know, as we know, if your lake has milfoil, it can be a phenomenal place to fish. Most fish species will utilize milfoil in one way or another. And because of that, it just makes it a great target, and it really gives us a good starting place to try to locate fish. The problem is milfoil can be so thick that there are not a ton of really good bait choices that will work when fishing in milfoil and around milfoil. And that just has to do with, you know, how efficient are you going to be? You can try to utilize almost any bait, but if you're throwing, say, a crankbait, you're probably going to be spending more time picking weeds off the treble hooks than you would if you were throwing something completely weedless. So I've got a handful of baits that I want to talk about here that hopefully will make you a better angler when fishing milfoil. You know, the first is pretty basic. It's a straightforward technique, which just has to do with fishing a Texas rigged plastic. You know, in this case, this is a Berkley Pit Boss, a power bait Pit Boss, one of my absolute favorite pitching baits. But any sort of Texas rigged, you know, craw style or small creature style bait like this will work really well when fishing around milfoil. I usually will pair it up with a bigger weight. This is an 1.5 ounce tungsten weight. You know, if you're throwing a 1/4 ounce or 3/8 ounce weight on your Texas rig plastic, you may not be able to get it through the weed and down to the bottom where a lot of those fish are. So you may have to upsize your weights. I will usually throw an 1 ounce to 1.5 ounce weight if we have matted over milfoil where I'm punching through. If you're just fishing random stocks that are kind of isolated here and there, you can definitely fish a lighter weight. But if you want to really increase your efficiency, you may have to go with a heavier weight. But first and foremost, a Texas rig bait like this Pit Boss is a great way to attack milfoil. Another really good way is to do it with your topwater. A basic bait, again, that probably most of you assume I would say, is a topwater frog like this Spro frog. Again, a great way to efficiently fish across matted milfoil. It really is just one of those baits that comes through the thickest of vegetation, and it can draw strikes from fish that are under those mats. The one thing I will say about fishing a frog, though, is if those fish are down lower in the weeds in that milfoil mat, they may not come up to hit this. So if you've got an 8-foot deep milfoil mat and those fish are hanging out by the bottom, your frog may not be the best approach to take. But countering that, if you're fishing milfoil that is shallower, say 4 foot or less, and is topped out or sparse, a frog is a great bait to utilize. Those fish will come up for it, and it will really just lead to some phenomenal blowups and some really entertaining fishing. So I always like to have a frog tied on. It may not be the best approach. You know, if you've got matted vegetation, if you choose between a Texas rig and a frog, you're really covering both gamuts really well. So what's that leave us with? Well, if you're fishing those mats, and in the videos previous to this about milfoil, I talk about this, a lot of times those fish aren't actually in the weeds. They're running the outside of those milfoil mats. And when that's the case, my go-to is a stickworm like this Berkley General. This is a Max Scent General. I just like the 5-inch size, the kind of the standard size. I rig it Wacky style. And I usually don't, hook it so it's weedless in any fashion. I just like an exposed hook because those milfoil edges quite frequently are very clean edges. So you'll have a solid wall and then nothing outside of that. A Wacky rig is a great presentation to approach those fish. You know, if they're just sitting on the outside, they're probably utilizing that milfoil wall to create good places to feed and attack prey. in this case, a Wacky rig is a great bait to generate those strikes. It is a slow, tedious way to fish. If you're fishing, again, an edge of milfoil that's in 8 feet of water, you may have to wait for this bait to fall, but it's worth it, guys. If they're on the outside, it's really hard to beat a Wacky rig. Now, to find those areas, because like I've talked about in those other videos, a lot of times the lakes that have milfoil are so overrun with milfoil that it becomes very intimidating as to where to start. Well, here's one of the things that I do. I will grab one of these two baits. I'll grab a swim jig. This is a dirty jig swim jig in their bluegill color. I've got a pit boss on the back, or a chatterbait. And again, with all of these colors, I generally tend towards more natural colors and bluegill colors. So this is a bluegill colored jackhammer. But between those two baits, what I'll do is I'll run those outsides of those milfoil lines, trying to find areas that have a better concentration of fish. These two baits will allow me to cover a lot of water. They're both really weedless, and therefore I can get that bait through those areas efficiently and covering a lot of water. Once I've identified areas where I'm getting bit on the swim jig or chatterbait, I will switch over to punching it or slowly working a frog through those areas. Hi, Duke. Do you need something? Yeah. Okay, I'll be right there. I'll be right there. Okay, I'll be right there. All right, guys, so the last bait I want to talk about is a Topwater Popper. This is a Berkeley Bullet Pop, again in their bluegill color. A popper is such a great bait to be fishing around milfoil, because almost everywhere you go that has milfoil, you'll find nice holes within the milfoil that you can throw a popper in and just slowly work back and forth to the point where you're basically keeping it in place. A popper is a great way to generate strikes in those areas that give the fish a totally different presentation than they're used to. Most people will not throw a treble hooked topwater bait in those holes. But when you're doing it, what I really want to recommend is you're trying to land in that hole and just slowly work it back and forth. Give it a couple twitches. You have to recognize that if you're doing that, you're probably going to, end up with a lot of grass on your cast. You're going to end up, missing some of the holes and just having some bad casts in that, in that presentation. But it's worth it because those fish will come up and eat this. The other thing I'm going to add with that is I do recommend throwing braided line to a small liter of monofilament, just so that you have a better chance of cutting through that milfoil to get the fish out once you've hooked up with them. Because if you do throw into some thicker milfoil where you got a bigger hole, those fish will get you down in that milfoil at some point. So if you're throwing a popper style bait, I recommend throwing braid on that. With most of these presentations, I do recommend throwing braid. The one that I would really probably lean towards not doing it is just your weightless Wacky rig. I do think that you can get away throwing fluorocarbon with that and some lighter lines, not super heavy. You can get away with 10-pound tests, because if you're fishing that clean edge, those fish, if you can keep them out from going back into it, you'll be all right. You'll be able to land those fish. So that's my setup, guys. That is pretty much exactly what I use every time I head out and I know I'm going to be fishing milfoil. It allows you to fish inside the milfoil, on top of the milfoil, and the edges of the milfoil. And I'm pretty confident in saying that at some place in that milfoil flat, you will find fish on those baits. So I hope that was helpful, guys. If it was, stay tuned. We got more tips and tricks coming out tomorrow. I got to go help the little guy out before he gets into all of my tackle tying vice stuff. So stay tuned, guys. Thanks for watching.